What Elvis did after that show stayed hidden for 20 years. When the truth came out, the world stopped. Memphis, 1974. The arena lights dimmed. Elvis stood backstage, sweat dripping from his forehead, his white jumpsuit still gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His manager was talking, but Elvis wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on a man sitting alone in the corner. A musician. Guitar case at his feet. Head in his hands. Something was wrong. Elvis could always tell. The show had been electric. 15,000 people screaming his name. But now, in this quiet moment, none of that mattered. Because Elvis had just overheard something that changed everything. Subscribe now, because what happens next will blow your mind. 2 hours earlier, the venue was chaos. Opening acts rushed through sound checks. Crew members shouted instructions. And in the middle of it all, a session musician named James Sullivan sat on an equipment case, staring at a piece of paper. His hands were shaking. James had been hired to play rhythm guitar for one of the opening bands. It wasn't much money, but he needed every cent. His wife was sick. Hospital bills were piling up. And that morning, he'd received a letter from the bank. Foreclosure notice. 30 days to pay $18,000, or lose everything. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. Then he picked up his guitar and walked toward the stage. Because that's what musicians do. They keep playing, even when the world is falling apart. Elvis arrived at the venue late afternoon. He always preferred to come in quietly, away from the crowds. But as he walked through the backstage corridors, he heard something that made him stop. A conversation. 2 crew members talking near the loading dock. "Did you hear about Sullivan? Poor guy's about to lose his house. Yeah, his wife's been in and out of the hospital for months. Medical bills wiped him out. And now the bank's coming after him. 18 grand? Where's he gonna get that kind of money?" Elvis stood perfectly still. The crew members didn't see him. They kept talking, unaware that the king himself was listening to every word. Then they walked away, and Elvis was alone in the hallway. He could have walked to his dressing room. He could have forgotten about it. But that's not who Elvis was. But what Elvis did next, nobody saw coming. Not his manager. Not his band. Not even James Sullivan himself. The show began at 8. Elvis hit the stage like thunder. The crowd erupted. He moved through his setlist with that familiar power, that magnetic presence that made him a legend. But between songs, during those brief moments when the lights dimmed and the crowd caught their breath, Elvis was thinking about James Sullivan. About the letter in his pocket. About a man trying to hold his life together while the world crumbled around him. When the show ended, Elvis didn't go to his dressing room. Instead, he found his tour manager and said 5 words. "I need to see Sullivan." The tour manager looked confused. "Who's Sullivan?" "The guitar player. One of the session guys. Bring him to my dressing room." 10 minutes later, James Sullivan stood outside Elvis Presley's dressing room, terrified. His mind raced. Had he made a mistake during the set? Was he about to get fired? He couldn't afford to lose this gig. Not now. The door opened. Elvis was sitting on a leather couch, still in his jumpsuit. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. "Come in, James." "Close the door." James stepped inside. His guitar case hung from his shoulder. His throat was dry. Elvis gestured to a chair. "Sit down. We need to talk." This was it. James was sure he was about to be let go. He sat down, hands gripping his knees. Elvis leaned forward. "I heard something today. About your situation." James felt his stomach drop. He didn't know what to say. "Your wife," Elvis continued. "The hospital bills. The house." James looked down. Shame burned in his chest. "I'm sorry, Mr. Presley. I didn't mean for any of this to." "Stop." Elvis's voice was firm but not unkind. "You didn't do anything wrong. Life happens. But here's what I want to know. How much do you owe?" James couldn't believe what he was hearing. I don't understand. The bank. How much do they want? $18,000. The words came out barely above a whisper. Elvis nodded slowly. Then he stood up, walked to a desk in the corner, and opened a drawer. He pulled out a checkbook and began writing. The only sound in the room was the scratch of pen on paper. James sat frozen. His mind couldn't process what was happening. And then Elvis did something that would remain a secret for 2 decades. Something that would only come to light long after he was gone. Elvis finished writing. He tore the check from the book and walked over to James. He held it out. This covers it. The whole thing. James stared at the check. $18,000. Made out to him. Signed by Elvis Presley. I can't accept this. James's voice cracked. This is too much. I don't deserve. You're a musician. Elvis interrupted. You work hard. You take care of your family. That's all that matters. He pressed the check into James's hand. But there's one condition. James looked up, tears streaming down his face. You don't tell anyone. Not your wife. Not your friends. Nobody. This stays between us. Why? James could barely speak. Elvis smiled, but there was something sad in his expression. Because I don't do this for the headlines. I do it because it's right. James tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He just sat there, holding the check, crying. Elvis put a hand on his shoulder. Go home. Take care of your wife. Save your house. And keep playing music. The world needs more musicians like you. James left the dressing room in a daze. He walked through the backstage corridors, past the crew members packing up equipment, past the opening bands loading their vans. Nobody noticed him. Nobody saw the check in his pocket. That night, James drove home. He didn't tell his wife what happened. He couldn't. He'd given Elvis his word. Instead, he deposited the check the next morning, paid off the bank, and told his wife he'd gotten a last-minute session gig that paid better than expected. She believed him. Why wouldn't she? And for the next 20 years, James Sullivan kept his promise. He never told a soul about what Elvis had done. Elvis continued touring. The years passed. His health declined. And on August 16, 1977, the world lost the king of rock and roll. James watched the funeral on television. He cried. Not just for the man who changed music forever, but for the man who saved his life. But the story doesn't end there. Because sometimes, the truth finds a way out, even when it's been buried for decades. In 1997, James Sullivan was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He knew his time was running out. And he realized that keeping Elvis's secret had become a burden. One afternoon, sitting in his living room with his adult children, James told them the story. About the letter from the bank. About the night he met Elvis. About the check that saved everything. His children were stunned. Why didn't you ever tell us? Because I promised him I wouldn't. But James wasn't done. He reached into an old wooden box and pulled out something he'd kept for over 2 decades. The original check stub. And a photograph. A Polaroid taken by Elvis's tour manager that night in the dressing room. Elvis and James shaking hands. James had forgotten the photo existed until he found it years later, tucked into his guitar case. I want the world to know, James said. Not because I need recognition, but because people need to know who Elvis really was. A few months later, James passed away. But before he did, he gave his children permission to share the story. They contacted a music journalist who had written extensively about Elvis's life. The article was published in early 1998. Elvis Presley's secret act of kindness revealed after 24 years. The story went viral before viral was even a word. News outlets picked it up. Documentaries included it. Fans around the world were moved to tears. Because this wasn't just a story about money. It was a story about humanity. About a man who could have had anything, but chose to give. About a superstar who understood that real power isn't measured in fame or fortune, but in the lives you change when nobody's watching. James Sullivan's family kept the check stub. They framed it. And today, it hangs in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, alongside a plaque that reads, "A reminder that true greatness is measured not by what we take, but by what we give in silence." But the ripple effect of Elvis's kindness didn't stop there. When the story broke in 1998, something unexpected happened. Letters started pouring in from all over the world. Not just from fans, but from people who had their own secret stories about Elvis. A nurse from Tennessee wrote about how Elvis paid for her mother's surgery in 1972. She had kept it quiet for decades, just as Elvis had asked. A car mechanic from Mississippi revealed that Elvis once bought him a new set of tools when his shop burned down. No press. No photos. Just a quiet act of generosity. A teacher from Alabama shared how Elvis anonymously funded scholarships for underprivileged students at her school. The checks came every year until his death, always with a note. "For the kids who need a chance." One by one, the stories emerged. A mosaic of kindness that had been hidden for decades. People who had been sworn to secrecy, finally free to speak after learning about James Sullivan's revelation. Elvis's estate was flooded with documentation. Cancelled checks. Letters. Photographs. Proof that the king of rock and roll had been quietly changing lives for years, always away from the spotlight. His accountant, who had managed Elvis's finances for over a decade, finally spoke up in an interview. "People think Elvis spent all his money on cars and jewelry," he said. "But I can tell you, a significant portion of his income went to helping people. He made me promise never to discuss it. He said if people know, it's not charity anymore. It's publicity." The revelation transformed how the world saw Elvis. Yes, he was a musical icon. Yes, he was a cultural phenomenon. But more importantly, he was a man who understood that true power lies not in what you accumulate, but in what you give away when no one is watching. James Sullivan's children established a foundation in their father's name, dedicated to helping struggling musicians facing financial hardship. They called it the Silent King Foundation, honoring the secret legacy Elvis left behind. Every year, on August 16th, the anniversary of Elvis's death, the foundation awards grants to musicians who need help. Medical bills. Foreclosures. Emergency expenses. The same kind of help Elvis gave to James Sullivan that night in 1974. And with every grant, they include a small card with a quote attributed to Elvis. "Real generosity doesn't need an audience. It just needs a willing heart." The story of James Sullivan and Elvis Presley became more than just a tale of financial rescue. It became a reminder that kindness doesn't expire. That secrets kept out of humility, not shame, have a way of inspiring generations long after the truth comes out. Today, when people visit Graceland, they often stop at a small exhibit tucked away in a corner. It's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. But those who find it are always moved. Inside a glass case sits the check stub. Next to it, the Polaroid of Elvis and James shaking hands. And beneath them, a simple plaque. The man behind the legend was greater than the legend itself. In 2015, a documentary filmmaker tracked down James Sullivan's daughter, now in her 50s. She agreed to an interview, sitting in the same house her father almost lost 4 decades earlier. "My dad carried that secret like a sacred trust," she said, tears in her eyes. "Even when we were struggling, even when he could have sold the story for good money, he never broke his promise. Because Elvis didn't just save our house that night. He taught my father what integrity really means." She showed the interviewer her father's old guitar. The same one he carried into Elvis's dressing room that night in 1974. Taped inside the case was a small note, yellowed with age. In Elvis's handwriting it read, "Keep playing. The world needs your music. EP." James had never shown that note to anyone while he was alive. It was discovered only after his death, hidden where only a musician would think to look. The documentary aired on the anniversary of Elvis's death. Within hours, it became one of the most watched music documentaries of the year. Comments flooded in from around the world. People sharing their own stories of quiet acts of kindness, anonymous gifts, silent help in times of crisis. Elvis's gesture had sparked something bigger than one man's generosity. It had reminded an entire generation that the greatest acts of humanity often happen in silence, away from cameras and applause. If this story moved you, share it. Let the world remember that Elvis wasn't just a performer. He was a man who understood that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is help someone when they need it most. Subscribe, and keep this legacy alive.